All right, everyone, thanks for attending. My name is Jim Crispino, and I'm your host today for the November-December DevCast. This will be our final developer webinar for 2020. And today I'm joined by John Carnell. He is going to talk about integrating with Genesys Cloud. So John heads up our, I'm going to get it wrong, developer experience team. Did I get it right, John?
Engagement.
The developer engagement team. Sorry.
All good.
Yeah. So, and what that means is our developer center, John runs that as well as some other things here at Genesys. And he's going to talk to you about how to integrate with Genesys Cloud. Before I hand it over to John, I want to give you some logistics here. So there will be a 10-minute Q&A at the end of the tutorial that John goes through. If you have a question, please use the Q&A option on Zoom here to post your question. We will answer some of them offline. We'll answer some of them online. We'll do our best to get all of the questions answered before we end. And then also this tutorial is going to be recorded. It is recording right now, actually. And it will be uploaded to our Genesys community YouTube channel. And you can access that from the video page on our developer center at developer.mypurecloud.com/video. And with that, that ends my slides, and I'm going to turn it over to John now.
All right.
Take it away, John.
Well, fantastic, guys. Thanks, everybody, for having me here. Just let me get my screen up and going. I have to warn you guys, most of the time when I do talks, I am a speaker and I'm wandering around. So if you suddenly see me disappearing off camera, I've forgotten that I'm on a webinar. And I've wandered off to the side as I'm talking, so I'll try to stay tethered in place. So the topic for today is really about integrating with the Genesys Cloud platform. With any of the technologies, any cloud technology you have, there's a lot of times a lot of new paradigms that are involved with integrating with it. Every vendor has their own little idiosyncrasies. And so today I want to talk about cloud integration in general, but specifically integrating with Genesys Cloud. So we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to talk a little bit about how integrations are a lot like trains and talk a little bit about APIs. And then I've broken the integration topics that we're going through really into three categories: behavioral integrations, data integrations, and presentation integrations. And in each of those three categories, I am going to talk a little bit about how we can use Genesys Cloud technologies to go out and implement those integrations. But before we get too far along, a little bit about myself. I am an architect and a team lead here at the Developer Engagement Group. I've been with Genesys since about 2015, working actually most of my time in the edge infrastructure team, and then just recently took on this team. Before that, though, I was actually the integration architect at a Fortune 300 financial services company, which makes this a subject that's very near and dear to my heart, particularly because I was also a member of that company's sit response team, which means every time something went wrong, I got paged. So I became very familiar with weekly implemented integrations. You know, you'll hear me probably say this over and over and over again. It's easy to write an integration. It's extremely difficult to operationalize it so it's resilient. In addition to that, I've spoken and written for years. I speak on the conference circuit, and my background is in Java development. I originally started as an Oracle DBA, and hopefully there's nobody in here that I offend, but I realized that I couldn't go through life angry as a DBA, so I switched over to development. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Oh, go ahead.
John, before you get going, I'm not sure you're sharing.
Huh, it shows my screen sharing. Let me share specifically my PowerPoint. How's that? Better?
There it is. That works.
Okay. Hey, don't worry. I understand technology, or at least that's what I like to claim. So what I always like to start out is, why are integrations a lot like trains in the railroad? Well, to answer that, you have to look at it like this. A railroad system is all about moving things, right? It's about moving people and materials. And a lot of times people don't really appreciate the amount of infrastructure that needs to be built up over time in order to move people and materials. And integrations are a lot like that, right? We spend a lot of time, they kind of get built up over time, and they move information and they carry out actions. And in particular, over time, people lose sight of what's going on underneath the covers. It's probably one of the more underappreciated pieces of software development within an IT organization. Everybody gets excited when they go out and they see a new web application that's being built, but they very rarely get excited about what's going on underneath the covers to pull together those data and processes. And I always like to say that no one ever complains when the trains are on time, and no one ever notices the integrations when they're running. So with that, I really like to look at integrating with the cloud as really falling into 3 categories or styles of integration. Now there's patterns out there for integration, like Greg Hoppy's book on enterprise integration. And what I'm going to go through is really not that. It's really 3 general broad categories. And the first style of integration is really behavioral integration. It's action oriented. It's taking out doing a small task. It's something along the lines of, I want my cloud provider to do something on my behalf or retrieve a piece of data for me. The second thing is a category is really on data, right? We focus on data synchronization. I want to move data in or out of my cloud provider. And we're not talking about little bits of data, for instance, for a single record lookup or anything like that. It's usually about being able to synchronize your data from the cloud back into your own data lakes or data warehouses. And that usually requires moving a lot of information usually in the evening hours or during the day in a near-time scenario. And the third category or style of integration is really around presentation. I want to be able to focus on UI integration so that my call center, my contact center has a seamless experience as they're working across all of the apps in my organization. And it really comes down to this. It goes, I want to embed my application within my cloud provider's interface, or I want to leverage part of my cloud provider's UI within my own application. But regardless of these 3 integration styles, when we're talking about cloud-based integration, by far the most prevalent thing we're going to run into are APIs. They're everywhere. And it really has become kind of the leading consensus that, if you're going to talk with your cloud, you're going to be using some kind of web service-based API that is going to carry information or ask your cloud provider to do something on your behalf. Well, Genesys Cloud was built as a platform-first API or application. And what that means is we started by writing all of our APIs and then building our applications on top of those APIs. So the Genesys Cloud UI is using the same APIs that we make available to everybody else. So it really offers us a very rich experience and offers our customers a very rich experience in being able to build applications and integrations. And almost the entire platform's functionality is really exposed through these REST-based APIs. Hence, a large amount of our integration capabilities all exposed through our REST APIs. Now, REST and our web service-based APIs are a very, very powerful model, and it's sometimes easy to forget as we're building integrations that they are distributed. And distributed API calls are always vulnerable to the 8 fallacies of distributed computing. I'm not going to go through them. I think anybody who's spent any reasonable amount of time in software development has come across these at one time or another, but it's something I've always said, and I go back to, it's easy to write software, it's hard to operationalize it. And so as we go through and we talk about not only the technologies that we're using here, always keep this in the back of your mind is how am I going to build my integrations to be resilient? So using our REST API means you got to plan for when things go wrong. I mean, for some of us, you had heard last week, AWS had a major outage, right? Things go wrong. So when you're thinking about building your integrations using our API and the Genesys Cloud platform, you really have to think on your end about, okay, I'm going to call this REST API. How am I going to protect my applications if that integration is having problems? And it's often very easy to write for the worst case scenario. The service is unavailable. It's much more difficult to write your integrations to be able to handle things like, hey, the service is returning back data very slowly. So really there's before we get into these integrations and we start talking about these REST-based APIs, keep in the back of the mind that whenever you do, you have to think about bulkheads, circuit breakers, and fallbacks. Now, bulkhead is nothing more than using a thread pool to kind of segregate your integration calls out into their own thread pool so that if you're having problems with the integration or with the call, it doesn't spread throughout the rest of your organization. The second thing is circuit breakers, right? If something goes wrong, after 2 or 3 tries, pop an error, try again in a few seconds. And finally, fallbacks. Do you have a plan for if that integration is unavailable? That could be something as simple as an alternative data source within your organization or leveraging a cache that you might keep with your data out there. Now, on our end, we tend to look at things a little bit differently, but we look at timeouts, rate limits, and fair usage, right? We have all these customers coming out here making calls to integrate their build applications and integrate with us. And so if a call is taking too long on a customer end, we'll shortcut the call. We'll, cut it down and basically time it out. We also enforce rate limits so that we don't have an abusive pattern situation. So if your integration is just calling our API at a very high rate, within a short window, we'll rate limit it and start returning a 429, indicating that there's a problem. Now, usually we do that, and what we have found is it's more often than not a coding problem from the integration part. A lot of times when we get into those situations, customers are like, I didn't even realize I was calling it that much. And then finally, the last thing that Genesys kind of worries about is fair usage. We're a multi-tenant platform, which means that we want to make sure that the platform is up for everybody. So we do have fair usage allocations surrounding our APIs. And if you go over that fair usage allocation, you'll be billed for it. Now, that being said, and I've heard our product manager, Becky, often say this, is we do not try to monetize our fair usage allocations or our APIs. Instead, it's really there to catch those excessive cases of where integrations are really putting a lot of pressure on the platform. Later on, as we go through some of our data APIs, I'll talk about some very specific use cases where customers have run into trouble in the past in using our APIs because they just selected the wrong kind of API for the particular use case that they were going after. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. We're going to go ahead and talk about behavioral integration styles first. And again, as I alluded to, behavioral integrations are really about carrying out a task. It can be a simple data lookup. It can be, I need to take an action. I need to create a user. I need to initiate something within the platform. They are going to be all REST-based and HTTPS-based, and almost all our behavioral APIs are going to be synchronous, which means we're going to give an immediate, you should get a request or response within a very short amount of time. Now, one thing to watch out for is some of our calls are synchronous, but all they do is return a 202. For instance, our job details API for our jobs API for analytics will do this: is you submit a request, we accept that request, and then we provide an endpoint that you can go and check to see if the request is done, but it's not actually doing any heavy computing. It's going on behind the scenes. Okay, so an example of what I like to pull out with a behavioral REST API integration is something simple, right? You have a particular workflow. It might be going on behind the scenes. For instance, you might want to provision some users coming from a CSV file that's been dumped into a directory or coming off of a queue. And you're going to use our API to basically just carry out a series of steps, right? That are very fine-grained, very short in nature. You'll authenticate, you'll create a user, you'll assign role users to that group in the roles, maybe create a WebRTC phone for them. This is a fairly common use case. We actually, this diagram I took from one of our starting guides that we've just started writing out there that really kind of gives an example of how these behavioral REST APIs work. And again, when you're looking at this, the key thing for these APIs is really understanding your usage patterns, how often those APIs are going to be called, and also understanding your failure modes. What would happen if this API suddenly returned an error return to 429 because it was you had exceeded your rate limit, whatever. Those are all things you have to take into account with behavioral REST APIs. All right. Now, in addition, in this behavioral category, what we saw before were REST APIs, right? You're directly calling them in some code, whether it's Python, Java, whatever. We do have some other mechanisms for carrying out some of these task-oriented actions. One of them is data actions. And what data actions are, it's a declarative mechanism for invoking a JSON-based REST service. And really, data actions are meant to be used from like our architect flows, our scripts, any kind of pre-call rule, or you can invoke them through the platform API. But what they're really for is where you might be building a workflow and you want to call out to some service and drop it in there, but you're not necessarily using code. You're doing it declaratively through our architect tool or through Archie, our flow tool. We do have a series of data actions that are out there already pre-configured and can be used by, immediately. They include Zendesk, Salesforce, and you can also plug in your own REST-based services into these data actions. So for instance, within your organization, if you have a particular piece of functionality that you want to expose to your architect flows, you could use a data action to declare or to wrapper that call and then use it within the architect flow or a script. Okay. The last one I just call out, we do have some webhook capability. We often do get some questions about, hey, how can I post to a group chat? We don't offer a true webhook or a generic webhook for all of our functionality, but our webhooks are very specific about, hey, I want to get some information from some process into our chat room. And that's what we support with webhooks. Now, in each of our sections, I'm going to kind of go through and talk a little bit about our developer tools. We've tried to, over the years, offer and simplify development by offering tools in our developer center. And if you haven't gone out there and looked yet, you can go out to developer.mypurecloud.com and you'll see a section out there for developer tools. For behavioral-oriented tools, I highly recommend everybody take a look at the API Explorer. The API Explorer is a web-based tool that will let you actually invoke our APIs directly within the web browser. And it's a great way to be able to go out and poke at an API, understand what the inputs and the outputs are. Plus, every one of our APIs will define what permissions you need for them. One of the most common things that people run into when they're first integrating with the platform is they want to be able to understand what are the security permissions and what kind of inputs and outputs are needed without having to go through and write a bunch of code. Now, if you don't want to use our API Explorer, we also offer full Postman Swagger definition files. So you can pretty much pull down Postman files down locally to your desktop and actually be able to use them directly within Postman. Me personally, I use kind of a combination of both. And then our last developer tool that's probably the most relevant is we offer SDKs in a number of different languages that basically wrapper our REST API. That way you're not having to go to a lower level programming model. You can instead just use the SDKs to carry out a lot of the tasks. The nice thing about the SDKs is they mirror our APIs exactly. So if you look here in our API Explorer, we have all these different groups of APIs, and then it drills down within each group. That structure is mirrored exactly in our SDK. So it makes it pretty easy to go back and forth. Oh, I think I just clicked on a link, excuse me. All right, there we go. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is data integration styles. And I always like to start this one out when I talk about data integration, because probably it's going on, I hate to say it, 20 years now. I had a boss back when I was a young consultant out of school who made the comment to me, and it's kind of always stuck with me, you know, and I'm going to use my Roger voice because he was kind of a veteran of the insurance industry. And he was like, you know, code changes, Carnell, but data is forever. You're going to spend a large amount of time just moving data from one point to another. And it's funny, that is very much a truism, probably sometimes to the point where I sometimes can wonder why I didn't listen to my mom and go to law school, but it's very true. Our code comes and goes. We have different languages, different frameworks, but the one thing that remains consistent is we got to have some way to be able to move and transform our data from whatever the system's out there. So when we do that and we think about that, we really have two ways to get large amounts of data out of Genesys Cloud and back to your organization. The first is by using our analytics API, which I'm going to caution, don't take me right there and say, oh, analytics API, that's the way to go. There's some very fine nuances in that we're going to go through. And that uses a polling mechanism, right? I'm just going to sit there, I'm going to write an integration, I'm going to call the REST-based API over and over and over again. The second mechanism is a push mechanism. And we really have two ways of doing this. This is where Genesys Cloud will actually push information as a stream of data to you back to your organization. Traditionally, we've always done this using our notification service and WebSockets, but we now are in beta on a very exciting new piece of technology called AWS EventBridge that will allow you to leverage AWS to give you a whole different quality of service for how data is pushed to your org and the resiliency associated with that. So let's go ahead and walk through these and look at these two different mechanisms, because probably the biggest thing I get pulled into is a lot of times in calls around developer engagement is when the wrong APIs have been selected in this space, particularly analytics. And, the customer's now in trouble. We have to try to figure out what's going on and how we can make things better. So analytics APIs, what's going on in my call center? There's really three different types of analytics APIs out there, and you will find them in the documentation on the Developer Center. And at the end of the slides, I also have a bibliography that points to a lot of this documentation. The first analytics API is observation. This is what's going on in my contact center right this minute. It is a snapshot of the queues, the users, and the flows. It does not look at data over time. It is just a call that says, what's going on? Give me this information. I have, I just want to see the current snapshot. The second analytics API is our aggregate API. And this is really is where you can start slicing and dicing the data, because it gives you a summarized view of your call center data over a period of time. And it allows you to collect data into time buckets. This is a really, really good API if you have to build an integration or an application that has to do ad hoc queries, because it allows you to look at the data in different dimensions. The third analytics API is really around details. This is the lowest level of detail returned around users and conversations. It's a ledger of all the activity related to conversations and users. And so this is a lot of times, as you look at, as a user is flowing through an interaction, is going through that journey from the moment they call in to hitting a queue, to being picked up, to being transferred over to somebody else. This is going to be captured as multiple pieces of information that need to be stitched together. Now, I want to go through this carefully, because this is where people tend to run into problems, because they don't understand the use cases where these analytics APIs apply. And at the bottom here, you'll see an overview link that really will point you to even more detail on this. So the observations API is usually used for building real-time dashboards and WEM integrations. This API can be pulled periodically to retrieve information, but you still have to watch your API rate limits and your fair usage. I believe, and don't quote me on it, but I believe we do 300 calls per minute on an OAuth client. So that would be your API rate limit. And your fair usage is actually broken down quite a bit across different APIs. So I'm not even going to try to go into that. But if you're thinking about, hey, I just need to be able to snapshot data every minute, every couple minutes of just what's going on in my queues or with my my users on the Genesys Cloud platform, observations is really the place to look at. The aggregate API is really used for ad hoc queries. I will say this again and again, use aggregate APIs for analysis, not data synchronization. And the same thing with the details. The details is really about being able to see all of the different parts of the conversation and the user behavior, but it was never designed for large scale exports of user and conversation data. Like for example, exports to a data warehouse. All right. So a lot of people naturally gravitate to the analytics detail API because it's fairly easy to understand. We have a good query tool and very powerful query language to be able to query it. But when people use this to try to do large scale data migrations, a lot of times they'll run into timeouts, right? They're trying to pull back too much information and it can take so long that we end up timing out the call or it just fails. And our analytics team is constantly working to make this our details APIs be able to do more and better data. But at the end of the day, when you're in a large call center, if you're trying to pull back a large amount of information, the reality is you can time out. And it's the same thing with the rate limiting and the fair use. It's very easy, for instance, if you're just trying to constantly pull the analytics detail API because you're trying to avoid grabbing large chunks of data, but you still want all that data, you're going to hit rate limiting, especially if you're like, okay, I want to try to leverage multiple calls or multiple clients. You're going to, basically hit your rate limits and fall out. So what are my two options? Well, there are a couple of different options. And the first one is a subset of the details API called the Analytics Jobs API. And the Analytics Jobs API is really will allow you to pull back large amounts of data over a period of weeks, but it's going to be 24 hours old. It's not near time. It's not the most up-to-date data, but you can pull back far more data without the timeout API rate limits and fair usage issues you would typically run into if you were using the details API directly. Now, I tell people because sometimes we will get, well, I need all my conversation data. It's got to be up to date. It's got to be near time. We have systems that rely on it. The Jobs API is a good way of exporting data, but if you're really looking at getting the most up-to-date information pushed near time, you want to look at our notifications model. I'm sorry, I'm a software developer. I had to get a Star Wars reference in there. So when we talk about notifications, we talk about one of two mechanisms to do that: WebSockets and AWS EventBridge. Okay, so I'm going to go into that in a little bit, but basically the Analytics Jobs API involves basically calling out to the Jobs API query endpoint, and you're going to get your data back. Oh, and I got my arrows going backwards. Apologize for that. You're going to get a 202 back after you've submitted your query, and then you're going to be periodically querying the job status query to see when your job is done. If I remember correctly, the job status query also includes a percentage of how far along the job is in actually processing. But the idea is remember how I was talking about you have a request response, but some of our APIs return a 202. The Analytics Job API is one of those jobs. All right. So again, I'm not going to beat a dead horse. Just don't use the Analytics Detail API for large scale data synchronization. You've been warned, okay? I've been there on too many crit sits when before I came to Genesys, where we found out that an API was abused, and then it's very painful afterwards to go back and rewrite that stuff. So let's talk about notifications. Notifications really offer an event stream of data. So when you think about notifications, you have all of these queue events, agent events, and conversation events essentially being emitted from Genesys Cloud. And it's just a stream of data that is being sent to your organization over one of two mechanisms: AWS EventBridge, which is in beta right now, or WebSockets. WebSockets is what's been out there and is currently GA. It's been out there for a long time. EventBridge is coming up now. So let's take a look at this. So when we talk about notifications via WebSockets, you're basically, if you need real-time or near-time data integration, you can go out and you can use our notification service to establish a WebSocket connection back to Genesys Cloud. In that WebSocket connection, you are also going to define the topics that you're interested in listening to. And those topics are then going to be published to your WebSocket and you can pick up and process them. Now, I always tell people, I'm like, look at the topics. There's a very rich body. If you go out, for instance, and I will cover this a little bit, if you go out to the developer tools and you look at the actual topics that are offered, you can find very close correspondence between the APIs and the data that's being published. Now, our WebSockets is also the mechanism that we use internally to publish changes in data back to our UI. So it's RFC adherent. The messages are sent in real time and they're not retried if the message can't be reset. And that's probably one of the things that you have to think about as you're building your WebSocket integration is, okay, I have to take into account that this connection could drop or something could happen. And then I need to be able to reestablish my connection. And I also need to understand that time period that that connection was down. So right now, when you use WebSockets, you have to tend to think a little bit more about the failure modes, but it is the mechanism to capture those events and incremental changes as going on. The other part of this too is if you're looking at capturing a large amount of data, you're responsible for scaling and consuming. So a lot of times, WebSockets can be chatty, or I should say Genesys Cloud can be chatty because we're publishing events constantly. And so you have to think about, can I build my integration to be able to pull that data off the WebSocket quick enough? Or am I going to have to open multiple WebSockets, multiple mechanisms to pull that out and process that data? Now, this is where things get a little bit better with EventBridge. And my product manager, every time I say EventBridge, she wants to go, it's still in beta, but I'm really, really excited about it. I want to share it with you guys. And if you have questions, you can ping the chat room in there about availability. But basically what EventBridge does is it takes all that data that we stream over from Genesys Cloud, and rather than streaming it over a WebSocket, it puts it over AWS EventBridge. And then from there, that EventBridge is basically a click and point integration that you can set up in your own AWS account. And then you can turn around and process that data any way you see fit. You could send it over to Genesys. Genesys has a 7-day retention on all data. You can drop it into S3 and process it in batch as it's coming in. SQS messages, it's pretty much once it's in AWS EventBridge, you can pretty much do anything you want with that data. Now, one of the nice things about AWS EventBridge, unlike the WebSockets approach, is that Genesys Cloud will attempt to publish to your EventBridge multiple times within a 24-hour period. So right now, if your WebSocket is down and we publish messages, they're gone. You basically have to, when the WebSocket connection is there, you have to go and grab data using the REST APIs for that small period of time that you were down. With EventBridge, you can actually say, hey, I want to put my data, I want to try, Genesys Cloud will say, hey, I'm going to retry multiple times if I can't talk to EventBridge. And then you can rely on AWS's own mechanisms to store that data for up to 7 days to be able to be processed then. And that 7-day period is if you were to use Genesys, okay? So that really is kind of a long-term enterprise data synchronization solution. And it's a preferred mechanism for when you're doing large-scale data synchronization where you're like, I have to have the most up-to-date data and I cannot lose a single message. Now, I always have to caution people, you really have to think carefully about your qualities of service before you dismiss WebSockets out of hand. Because with a little bit of design work, WebSockets can be very reliable. And frankly, it's the mechanism that we use for our client. So if your WebSocket is down for your integration, chances are the client's WebSocket is down too. So we use them constantly, and I would encourage people not to just immediately go, oh, well, I have to use AWS EventBridge for everything. We have a lot of different mechanisms for doing it. Now for data tools, there's really two data tools. One that I like to encourage people to look at is our analytics query builder. This is an incredibly powerful tool because it lets you basically model out across all of our different APIs a query that you would like to issue. And it actually lets you build that query right within the tool and then execute it and see some data coming back. Now, why is this powerful? A lot of times I find you got to play with the data a little bit before you capture it in code. And because we offer a very rich query language, it can be a little complicated to just try to build it by hand. So I personally find myself a lot of times using the analytics query builder to kind of figure out, am I getting the data back that I want? Is it the data that is it in the structure I need? And then I can literally cut and paste from the tool the query that I can then go use to issue out to the APIs to get my data. The other thing that take a look at is our notifications testing tool. If you are looking at notifications, you can basically go out and have a web-based tool. It's in the developer center, and you can subscribe to those notifications and actually see the data coming out. So imagine, if you will, what I do a lot of times is, because I'm working through this right now, I'm actually writing some integration examples of how to use our notification API, is I will have my Genesys Cloud organization open. I'll have some queues set up for me being logged in. I will have the notification tester open with listening to queue observations or queue activity or user activity. And then I can actually do actions within Genesys Cloud and see the data coming back across. This is a very, very powerful tool, because one of the things that we really try to emphasize when we're using, building these tools is play around with it, understand the API, understand the data before committing it to code. Okay, so we are kind of coming into the third part of the presentation and into the home stretch, and that's around presentation integration styles. Now, the presentation integration patterns really, or styles, really focus on, hey, I either want to embed my application in Genesys Cloud. Maybe I have a scripting or a knowledge-based application that I want to embed directly in the Genesys Cloud UI, or I have functionality that I want to build within my own application. For instance, I want to be able to go out and embed components or call controls within my own application, or chat components. So let's go ahead and walk through these. When we talk about presentation integration, we really are talking about two different things. The first is agent-based integration. That is, I am integrating something that my agent is going to use. And really, we have four different technologies that can be used here. One is client apps, and this really just lets you insert an existing application directly into an iframe inside of Genesys Cloud. This is very useful. I mean, one of the things I remember years ago, I was shocked at how many applications a lot of times have to be open on a call center person's desk in order to carry out a customer transaction. You know, the more you can consolidate and build that right into one tool, the more that their lives become easier and the better experience it is for a customer. We also do have scripts that can be script applications that can be presented directly in the context of a conversation. And we have an embeddable framework, which is just a series of JavaScript widgets, which lets you put Genesys Cloud directly in your application. Okay. Oop, I skipped one. And finally, our Web RTC SDK. Now, from an end user-based integration, we have the ability to integrate chat. So you can take a chat functionality, embed it right into your web application, and it will talk back to an agent running within Genesys Cloud. We have screen share, co-browse, and then the last thing I'm going to mention is we have web messaging. And this is really our next generation multimedia web messaging tool. It's meant long-term to replace guest chat. We're not saying we're replacing it right now, but it's meant to be a much more multimedia experience, much deeper experience. And we're looking at targeting that for release in sometime in 2021. All right, a couple things also to think about is you don't have to build everything yourself if you're doing integrations with your UI. We have our Genesys App Foundry, and it's a marketplace out there for apps that extend the Genesys Cloud UI, and we have both premium and free options. Basically, partners go out there. Some people have made their stuff completely free. Others offer it with a trial or try before you buy. But you'll be amazed, I think, at the amount of functionality out there. We have knowledge bases. We have AI chatbots, that can be just configured and put right down into your Genesys Cloud application. If you want to explore that, I put the link down here for App Foundry. The other thing to look at from an integration perspective, particularly if you're looking at doing third-party integrations outside of Genesys Cloud, is to look at our blueprints. Our blueprints is something new, and it's something we're pretty excited about. It's in-depth guides and code examples of how to integrate with third-party cloud providers and partners. We have we're building up this library of basically code and articles that talk to you about, well, hey, I want to integrate Lex into my application, and I want to do it with Genesys Cloud. How can I do it with the least amount of effort? And that's what these blueprints are really there for. You can also, the blueprints are accessible through App Foundry. You can actually search on them as a category. So if you go to the App Foundry website, you type in blueprints, you'll actually get back all the available blueprints. Okay, a couple of relevant developer tools for development integration is our chat handler. This basically lets you simulate, hey, I'm trying to set up integrations with chat and I want to just be able to test my code, or I want to set it up and be able to drop in the JavaScript directly into my code. That's what our chat handler does. It lets you basically mock out some of the most common chat integrations and have it generate the actual script tags that you would use for integration. We have our developer blueprints, and then we will be putting the web messaging docs out there. We're currently finishing up the work and preparing for them to go in beta. So that's why you'll see them in TBD. What I would tell people is just kind of watch the site, talk with your, look at the developer newsletters, talk with your account managers, if that is something that you would be interested in. Okay, some closing thoughts. So number one, take the time to understand what integration style you're using and select the right technology for implementation. I can't say this enough, because usually when people get into trouble, from an integration perspective with our APIs, is because they naturally gravitate to something they understand, and then they start using it without fully understanding the details of it. I go back specifically to our analytics API. The other thing is understand your durability and reliability requirements. I will now be the third time I've said this during this presentation. It's easy to write the integration. It's hard to operationalize it. So you have to think about what those requirements are before you start implementing. The second thing is understand your usage patterns for your integration points. Genesys Cloud is not unique in this. All vendors have some kind of rate limits, or I shouldn't say most vendors have some kind of rate limits. So familiarize yourself with the rate limits and the fair usage policies before building integrations with the platform. What often happens is integrations are built during initial implementation, and then problems are not discovered until 2 or 3 months after people have gone live and you're finally fully bringing up the site with all the traffic. So to avoid some pain and really avoid very common problems that we've seen, really familiarize yourself with those general API rate limits, and then also the API specific rate limits. And finally, understand the failure modes in your integrations. Make sure you have circuit breakers in case Genesys Cloud has issues. Did you put retry logic and timeouts in place? Do you have the appropriate fallback mechanisms? Those are all things that you have to think about when you're integrating with Genesys Cloud or really any cloud provider out there. And these are all things that I've just learned from very, very hard experience of being on crit-sit response calls at 3 in the morning because some critical integration failed and the site's down or we don't have the latest data. So please take the time before you start writing code to think about what your failure modes are. All right, so as I promised, we have a bibliography out here that I tried to capture all the links and endpoints. I will leave it to Jim. I don't know, Jim, how we would distribute the deck, but we can make the deck available if people want the direct endpoints or a copy of the deck.
Yeah. So John, we'll put the deck on the YouTube channel along with the video. It'll be down in the comments section. We'll have a link to it there.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. Any questions? I'll try to answer them as best as I can.
Yeah. So if you have a question, please post into the Q&A section of Zoom, and we'll get it answered. John, we had quite a few questions come in. Becky Powell's been sitting there banging out the answers in the background for you. So that's been great. Thanks, Becky.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Becky.
Sure thing.
No, sorry,
All right.
I didn't change my slides on you too quick.
All right, here's
control here with the buttons. Go ahead.
John, are the fair usage limits standard or calculated per customer?
I'll let Becky answer that. I'll give you the
Yeah.
Becky, go ahead, please.
So all of our fair usage allocations, and that's for data storage, IVRs, and API usage, is based on your Genesys Cloud license type. So whether you're a 1, 2, or 3, and the number of seats that you have. So bigger organizations are allocated more free API calls. So we designed the system to be as equitable as possible. And as John mentioned earlier, our objective is not to nickel and dime or to monetize, but to really if our customers are receiving so much value out of our APIs that they're going above and beyond their fair usage allocation, that we're addressing that accordingly. So yes, it does scale depending on the size of your organization.
Great, thank you, Becky.
All right. Happy's got one. Is there a blueprint available on how to best and quickly integrate call controls in another web application?
Ooh, that's a good one. So we are always interested in ideas for blueprints. I shared my email address in the chat earlier and as well in the Q&A to contact me to participate in the EventBridge beta. The same email address is a great place to contact me if you have ideas for blueprints. I'd be really curious to know which web application that you'd be interested in seeing a blueprint on. So we definitely welcome these topics. And if you'd like to partner with us to create a blueprint, we always welcome that as well.
Yeah, and so you guys know, we have been ramping up our developer engagement team, both from an engineering and content perspective, because we are really looking for getting this type of information out there. I think one of the things we recognized early on is while we have a lot of information on our developer center, particularly our APIs, a lot of times we don't do a good job of connecting the dots. And so we're trying to attack both ends of the scale, both with blueprints, which provide more of the hands-on deep integration, and also starting guides. So definitely send that information or request for information to Becky. She's our product manager, and that comes right to us to decide what we're going to do as our next set of activity.
Hey, Happy, one other thing to add there is we do have what we call the Genesys Cloud embeddable framework. So if you go to the developer center at developer.mypurecloud.com and you click on APIs, on the left-hand side, you'll see a link called Genesys Cloud embeddable framework. And that is a small web-based widget that is designed to be embedded in a third-party web application, such as a CRM, or a ticketing system, really any web-based app. And it gives you full call control, gives you the ability to handle emails, chats, messaging. It is a reduced real estate user interface because it's meant to be embedded, but it does give you most of the control for handling the conversations that would be routed to you as an agent.
Yeah, great point, Jim.
All right, I've got a couple more here. Okay, so I might have answered that for, oh, they're not questions so much. Happy responded, and so did Christy. So, all right, are there any other questions? All right. I would encourage you, if you have further questions or you think of something after this, the Developer Center, if you scroll to the very bottom, you'll see a link to our forum, and you can go to our developer forum and post questions there. That forum is monitored by everybody on this team, as well as many others within Genesys, and we'll be happy to answer your questions for you there as well.
All right. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate you guys spending some time with me. And to Jim's point, I'm one of those people that hangs out on the developer forum and watches it pretty regularly. So if you have comments, feedback, or questions from this presentation, please post out there and I will be watching for them. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for joining, everyone. We'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.